Can you summarize for me the threats of acts of serious violence that the invocation was based upon?
I'll do that. I think the clerk will probably add. So if you just look at what you went through this week, who you heard. So we heard from not CSIS, but we've heard from some players, for example, that IMV were present in some of the protests. We've heard also that ex-militaries and ex-law police agents were present. We heard the presence of firearms. We heard also a threat to our economy, threat to and impacts on workers. We just talked about that before. We heard impact on our trade relationship and from GAC. We've heard from CBSA that our port of entry was affected, disrupted, and other port of entries, even after the main war were clear.
Okay.
So we heard from transport also that some rails can be affected by blockades. Right. So we've heard from not only, you're going to hear from CSIS Monday, but, when you look at the composition of DMOC, you've heard about that many times over the week. Many departments are part of that DM's committee. Why? Because national security is not the result of the assessment of one agency, but the result of, as Janice said, the clerk said before, the town.
I don't mean to interrupt. I only have so much time left.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I just want to talk to you about first, you mentioned the IMVEs, right?
Yep.
And you can agree with me that an IMVE, it's not just somebody who's radical or whatever. There has to be an element of violence. So
a couple of things here. And when you look at C, we want to talk about that. Careful about its threat or serious violence.
Okay.
I guess the or can be an N.
Right. It's a threat of or I understand. So these IMVs that the government went on about, first, we've already established that the government wasn't aware of the individuals in Coutts at the time of the invocation that were arrested by the local police department.
I think what we were aware in Coutts was, first of all, they were about to do enforcement, and then I think it was around the 10th or the 11th of February, we heard that they were slowing down enforcement because of the presence of risk of violence and guns. That's the only thing we knew at our level, because we're not privy to all the operational risk. So that's what we knew at Coutts.
But of course, Commissioner Lucky and her people, they were aware of what was going on. They just couldn't tell you.
Exactly.
Right. And you're now aware, I'm sure you've heard the evidence, that they, in fact, as of the February 9th, had 2 undercover officers embedded with these gentlemen. Are you aware of that?
I was not aware at that time. When they do uncover operation, this is the...
Yeah.
we don't know those things.
And these gentlemen that they were going after, they were actually local to the Coutts area. You know that?
I can say I didn't know at that time, no.
Can you agree with me that the facts of that were that that issue was dealt with locally by police under provincial mandate via the agreement that Alberta has with the RCMP?
You mean the contractual policing arrangement?
Correct. It was carried out under that, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so it was provincially dealt with? You agree it was dealt with well?
So I don't know at the end when, they put an end to the blockade, who was doing what.
Okay.
And whether, I'm sure you have heard about that the police of jurisdiction can ask more resources from the center using the section 9.2 of their arrangement. So I don't know.
Okay. And so let's move to Ottawa. Ottawa, IMVs in Ottawa. I understand that CSIS advised that they had no concern with IMVEs in Ottawa. and that's what's in evidence. Is that correct?
Well, this is not how I portrayed that. I understood, and I've heard that some IMV and subject of interest of CSIS were present. What I understand from their assessment is that they didn't conclude that they need or they have to open new investigations.
Right. And so CSIS did a threat assessment of the convoy, and we saw it yesterday. And I can.
They did, not of
the
the convoy as a whole, again, sorry.
of Ottawa. And let me bring that up. And it is the document ending it's ts.nSC.can.0000159_rel_0001. Now, we've all reviewed this. I've put it to folks, and I don't want to have to read it to you. But in this assessment, and also in the statement from Director Vignon, they concluded that there was no CSIS threat, reasonable suspicion of a CSIS threat in downtown Ottawa. Is that fair?
They concluded, looking at who was there, that they didn't have enough to open investigations on specific individuals or groups.
Right. And you know that CSIS only needs to have a suspicion, a reasonable suspicion, to open an investigation.
Well, I think the test is reasonable ground, yep.
Reasonable grounds to suspect. Reasonable grounds to suspect. That's what it says. You know that.
Yeah.
And the difference between that and the grounds to invoke a national emergency is that, you know, under the Emergencies Act, it requires reasonable grounds. You know that. That
a public order emergency
Right.
exists.
And you know, as the former highest ranking lawyer and legal officer within the government of Canada, that reasonable grounds to suspect is a lesser threshold than reasonable grounds, or referred to as reasonable and probable grounds. You are aware of that.
Again, I'm sorry, I think we are mixing here. Reasonable ground to suspect what? And this is the purpose of CSIS Act.
Right.
So a movement can represent threat to security to Canada.
Right.
A movement, a situation.
An activity.
An activity.
An activity.
Without having individuals or groups into it that do meet the threshold of CSIS. So I think we need to make the difference between what the movement represented at that time for Canada versus the composition of the movement, whether or not we had individuals that, so there's...
But ma'am, I understand what you're saying, but you're saying that you want to look at the group as a whole. All right. And so I've asked you about Coots, that was taken care of. I've asked you about Ottawa, all right? You knew that the group, the assessment was that it did not meet that. And now Windsor. Can you agree with me that there was no Section 2 CSIS Act threat with respect to Windsor?
You've mischaracterized the witness's evidence. She didn't agree with you that CSIS had assessed the group, the entire group in Ottawa.
Right. So let me just move over to Windsor. Can you agree with me that you are aware of no Section 2 CSIS Act threat with respect to Windsor?
I think I can go again through everything we have heard from all departments, and that the clerk, with my advice in particular, considered to determine whether or not we believe that the threat, the test under the Emergency Act.
Let me try and rephrase it this way. What evidence and what information of violence at Windsor were you aware of when the act was invoked?
I think it would have been a mistake to do assessment site by site while we were facing a national movement and situation.
Thank you for answering my questions.